Welcome to 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act Virtual Pilgrimage. I'm the Reverend John Borthwick, and here at St. Andrews in Guelph, we're encouraging our congregation to read through the 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act book by Bob Joseph. It's an incredible book that sort of highlights all of these different aspects of the Indian Act, and for most Canadians, I have a degree in Canadian history. I would say, it's been a while since I was in university, but let's say, I would say that I don't remember being taught a lot about the Indian Act, being taught about residential schools, like the fullness of those stories. I went to school a while ago and have a degree in Canadian history. And yet, a lot of these things were missed out. I think some of that is being addressed in our Canadian school system now, which is wonderful. But so many of us aren't 100% sure, have a lot of assumptions. We're meant to question our assumptions always, but also just don't know the ways in which a piece of legislation of our Canadian government had the intention to control the movement, the activity, the daily living of Indigenous peoples in this country, and intentionally sought to eradicate who they were, their culture, everything about them. The quote that is often heard is, "We want to kill the Indian in the child." That is, as defined today, cultural genocide. And sadly, it's not as simple as cultural genocide, because we are consistently confronted with the fact, and rightly so, we should be every single day confronted with the fact that people died. People have died who were Indigenous based on this legislation, this act, this way of controlling Indigenous people's lives. And on top of that, their children died. So many children, thousands of children died being forced to attend residential schools. And we are continuing to learn the impact of that. We are continuing to learn more about what may have happened, and how one redresses that, how one finds justice in all that, how one does the work, the hard work of truth and reconciliation, as if there's a relationship that's easily reconciled after all of this. This is a hard journey for Canada, for our country, and for each of us. So being informed is an excellent first step. Taking action would be the most important next step, and determining what that looks like, figuring out how to navigate that. All that being said, we're at number 15, leased uncultivated reserve lands to non-Indians. And for this one, it's important, I think, to read a couple of quotes, because again, we're talking about assumptions. We're talking about what are people, what decisions are people making on behalf of another community or other people, without their consent, without their permission. They're just doing it because they can. So here's a couple of quotes just to get us into this. And this is the season in Canadian history where, again, settlers are heading to the west and the prairies, and there's a need for land. There's another uptick after the wars, where people are in need of land. They want veterans from the wars to come and settle and find land as well. And as we know, a part of the Indian Act was setting aside land called reserves, where we sort of pushed Indigenous people, this is where you'll live. So on one side, it's this idea of, okay, here's the land that you've given us or told us we have to live on. And I guess We have to accept that. But having done that, they then take land, reserve land, from them. And that's a part of the Indian Act. And so here's an assumption that's made by a minister of the Interior and the superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1918. So just as the First World War is concluding, his name's Arthur Meehan. He says this: "We would be only too glad to have the Indian use this land if he would, but he will not cultivate this land, and we want to cultivate it. That is all." So they defined what uncultivated land looked like, and so they amended the Indian Act to allow for reserve lands held by, and hear this, held by physically disabled Indians, widows, orphans, or others who could not cultivate their lands to be leased out, and to do so without band approval or surrender of title. And here's what Bob says about this. What the government ignored or failed to understand was that just because land was not cultivated did not mean it was not being used. Uncultivated land provided crucial habitat for the animals and plants that had sustained Indians for generations. Talk about these assumptions being made and these actions that occurred. It happened again as the First World War was ending. It happened again following the Second World War. And luckily, luck sounds like a terrible way of expressing it, but Bob does at least offer, maybe, a notion that after the Second World War, the Department of Indian Affairs was maybe having some sober second thoughts. One official stated, he says, that consent to the surrender of Indian reserve land had been given rather unwisely in the past, when, as a matter of fact, having in mind future development and requirements, such lands should have been retained for Indian use. This has become the leasing of reserve land and surrenders of reserve land has become such a massive legal challenge for Indigenous communities across our country. But this idea that I think what stands out the most is you've not only taken people from the land that they were living on for generations, moved them to another space that was more convenient for you as the authority, as the power. And then after that, you then simply, because you decide that they're not using it well, properly, the way in which you think it should be used, you're just going to take some of it back, lease it out to other people, give it to someone else. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine, just for one brief second, can you imagine you own a house and you have a bit of property, and the government comes along and says to you, we're just going to take actually all of your front lawn because we don't like how you've landscaped it. And we're actually going to lease it out to somebody else, and they're going to make it better. And it won't be your land anymore. You can't go on the front lawn anymore. You can't participate on the front lawn because it's been leased out to somebody else. Can you imagine that kind of action happening? And with no ability to fight back, no ability to redress it. Certainly there's been challenges all the way along to try and settle some of these claims and challenges, but the fact that one has to find themselves in a fight for land that they didn't want and didn't ask for and wasn't the land that they lived on previously, essentially, but find oneself, in order to just have some place to call their own, have to fight to get the land that they were given originally back to them. What a strange and weird world the Indigenous community has to navigate with our Canadian government. This is number 15 of the 21 things you may not know about the Indian Act. Thank you so much for being on this journey.